14th of December 1939, and there's a newspaper report here on the Russian invasion of Finland. And it's fascinating because first of all, it's really descriptive the way it tells the story of the invasion. But secondly, it paints a real picture of how difficult it was and how complicated it was for the Russians to invade a country the size of Finland. In the Arctic twilight, which northern Finns call day, soldiers shrouded in ghostly white robes skimmed silently on skis down the trackless hillside last week. Merging with the snow-blanketed terrain, they descended on invading red soldiers from behind crags and boulders, harassed them with their stubby, quick-firing pistols and machine guns. Black night fell swiftly. Then the agile Finns flitted away like dim white bats, and a blinding hell replaced them. Heroic volunteers stood with portable searchlights, throwing a beam from reflectors slung on their chests, breaking the darkness for 1,500 feet ahead. Skiing sharpshooters fled round the beams to attack the dazzled enemy. Inevitably, each searchlight man was the first victim of Russian counterfire. Behind these guerrilla bands, troops brought up fresh arms on cradle-like sledges. Sure-footed ponies, used to the crackling snow, pulled up the bigger guns through the long night on their runner mountings. Wily Finnish commanders put at least one local man, knowing every inch of the ground, in each detachment to act as guides for patrols. In such heartbreaking conditions, struggling in about 20 degrees of frost, Russian troops, unused to the gruelling demands of the Arctic, were continually outwitted. Instead of the walkover he had banked on, Joseph Stalin watched his attack freezing up. The Red Army was temporarily outnumbered. Against an alert, well-equipped force of 300,000, of whom a large part were already engaged in the line, Russian commander General Merskov could deploy only 6 divisions, 90,000 men along the whole frontier. Reports added that the Soviet troops were not too enthusiastic about risking their skins for a Stalinite aggrandizement. Hastily, General Merskov brought up reinforcements to give the attacking army the strength of around 500,000. If that should not prove sufficient, more were to follow until the old-style Russian steamroller was in full motion. So the British press are painting a picture of how difficult the Russians are finding the conquest of Finland and how bravely the Finnish are fighting. As always, you know, it's looking at it from one perspective, but it's interesting. So battles were in progress in 4 different areas where aggressors had made their initial advances. Isthmus. The showfront of the war was the craggy Karelian Isthmus, the narrow land link between the Finnish Gulf and Lake Ladoga, where the frontier is only 25 miles from Leningrad. Across the isthmus, the Finns had built the strong Mannerheim defence line, named in honour of their tried and trusty Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim. The line guards the town of Vyborg and the main road to Helsinki. The Russians made their main effort on this 60-mile wide front, but this week they had not reached the main defence line. At most they had advanced around 15 miles from the frontier. They went forward carefully. As soon as they had taken a point, they dug themselves in, bringing up workers to clear away mines from the forest. In the few villages which fell into their hands, they appointed Soviet mayors and officials, nominally subordinated to the puppet People's Government which they had set up in Teriyaki. Even so, the attackers suffered setbacks. The Finns had placed some old field guns dating from Tsarist days in advance of their main line. They expected these guns would have to be sacrificed and wanted to save their more modern artillery. But the attackers' progress was so slow that the old cannon were this week still barking raucously and claiming casualties. Some reports maintained that the Reds had crossed the lake-like outlet of the Vuokosi River at Kiviniemi near Lake Ladoga and broken the Mannerheim line, but Finns denied this and declared that they had made counterattacks further south. Because the Russians were painfully aware of their difficulties in breaking through this fortified bottleneck, they planned intensive efforts in the other war areas. And then thirdly, we've got the lake battle. By nosing round the northern shore of Lake Ladoga, the biggest in Europe, the Reds hoped to strike at the Mannerheim line from the rear. The lake was frozen, but the ice was not thick enough for an advance. Pressing forward along its north bank, the Reds occupied the villages of Salmi and Tolvajärvi, but soon came to a standstill. A sharp thaw then set in. Melting snow transformed the country into a slushy bog. Tanks got stuck and became easy prey for the Finns. According to Helsinki reports, the Russians lost 2,000 men and 80 tanks. A week earlier, the Russians had accused the Finns of using poison gas, but last week this story was reversed and the Finns claimed that the Red troops at Salmi had fired shells filled with chloropicrine and caused 11 casualties. No gas masks are to be had in northern Finland, and the defending troops were served out with linen nosebags containing powdered charcoal. British firms meantime prepared to supply gas masks. And then thirdly, we've got the waistline struggle. Most dangerous to the Finns was the advance made by a Red force across the narrow waistline of their country, which is only 125 miles wide between the port of Oulu and the Soviet frontier. By cutting across this wasp waist, the Russians planned to split the country into two parts, severing from Helsinki and the south the Arctic port of Petsamo, the nickel mines and the railway line to Sweden. Defying the terrors of the Arctic night, Red troops took the town of Kuolajärvi 20 miles inland. There they awaited reinforcements. They were still 50 miles from the railhead at Kemiajärvi, whence the railway line runs down to the port of Torino on the Bothnian Gulf. Another detachment pushing directly towards Oulu reached the town of Suomussalmi. And then we've got the northern battle. The greatest blow for the invaders was when the Arctic port of Petsamo, captured in a surprise attack on the first day of the war and retaken a day later, was still nobody's town. Soviet troops which had landed in the outer fjord suffered heavily from the fire of Finnish troops entrenched in the rocks. Gaining courage, defending airmen took the offensive, bombed the Arctic port of Murmansk as well as troop trains on the Soviet side of the frontier. The nickel mines near Petsamo were still in the defenders' hands, but other invading troops, according to Moscow reports, short-circuited Petsamo and were this week 50 miles further south, marching along the Arctic Highway, the single route connecting the port with its hinterland. And then we've got Gulf War. Though most of the fighting was taking place on land, the sea had an important part to play in Stalin's campaign. To cut off foreign supplies from his opponents, he declared a blockade of the Finnish coasts. The country is hemmed in by two gulfs, and conditions on one coast are very different to the other. In the south, the Gulf of Finland was free for the Reds to play about in. But after bombarding the Isle of Hogland, the Russians discovered that it had been deserted by the Finns. Swiftly, its new masters set about fortifying it. From their bases on the Estonian coast, Red airmen made a raid on the port of Hango. Many bombs were dropped, but most of them plumped into the water and little damage was done. In the Gulf of Bothnia, which separates Finland from Sweden, things went badly against the Soviets. Minefields laid by Finland and Sweden near the Åland Islands barred the entrance, making the whole Gulf a Finnish-Swedish lake. Even so, 3 or 4 Soviet submarines apparently succeeded in passing into the Gulf. A German steamer, the Oliver, limped into a Bothnian port after being damaged by 3 shots from one of them. When she stopped, Russian sailors came aboard to examine the ship, later allowing it to proceed. And then it carries on under the title Bitter Battle, and it's talking about the role that Estonia played in the conquest of Finland, because Estonia is where the Russians had air bases, and they'd only recently become a vassal state to the Russians, and the relationships were quite tricky. So the article's titled Bitter Banquet. After their one day of horror, the inhabitants of Helsinki passed a week free of air raids. This was remarkable, particularly as the Soviet Air Force shed bombs on a number of provincial towns, such as busy Tampere, which is Finland's Manchester. Some thought the capital was spared because it was most of the week enveloped in low clouds. Others attributed it to difficulties which the Russians encountered in their new air bases on the coast of Estonia. There were sinister stories of sabotage at Bolsky Aerodrome. The Ests, who are blood brothers of the Finns and only recently vassals of the Soviets, were apparently unwilling to help in the destruction of Finland. No Red is General Johan Laidona, Estonia's commander-in-chief. At heart, he is as strong a white as Finnish Field Marshal Mannerheim himself. But the army which Laidona still commands is now allied to the Bolsheviks. He therefore could do nothing but obey when he was summoned to the Kremlin for a visit. Fearing the worst, the general was, to his immense surprise, treated to a banquet attended by Stalin and Molotov. With a smiling face, but probably with bitter feelings, the Estonian who once boasted that he had captured hundreds of Reds and had them shot the same afternoon, heard speeches in which Russia's friendship with the small Baltic states was lauded. He had to answer in the same vein. While Laidona was thus used to a sort of decoy to demonstrate the pleasures of captivity to his obstinate Finnish cousins, he was privately warned that troubles at the Estonian bases would have to stop if Soviet reprisals were to be avoided. If you like this content, please take a look at my channel, not history but news. I'm going through a big box full of old newspapers from the 1940s that I found in an attic, and they're full of really interesting things. I've just uploaded an article from February 1940, which is explaining that the German press have announced that Hitler will have conquered Britain by April and will have pronounced himself King of England. And then the article goes into a great kind of description as to what life might be like in Britain under the Nazis. It's a really interesting read, so please take a look. Thank you.